Welcome to God in the Wild. I'm your host, Kent Harrop. In this first season, we'll explore how nature heals, inspires, and restores us. We'll consider, too, ways in which the natural world connects with and awakens us on our spiritual journey. John Muir, the great conservationist and mystic, put it this way: "Into the forest I go to lose my mind and find my soul." Each episode will reflect upon ways nature speaks into and expands our spiritual lives. Welcome to God in the Wild. I am recording this from one of my favorite places on the planet, the Audubon Society Reservation along the Endicott Trail in Massachusetts. It's a place where I come just to renew my spirit and to breathe deeply. John Muir, the founder of the Sierra Club, said, "I go to the wild to lose my mind and feed my soul." So, join me now in this beautiful natural setting, and may your soul be fed. So how do we manage our fear? Fear is a normal part of life. And I think fear is fueled by what economists call the economy of scarcity. In the economy of scarcity, it says that there's only so much to go around. We have to protect our turf. We have to protect our tribe. We have to protect our family. We have to protect our nation. And if we have anything left over, we may choose to be hospitable. The whole debate around immigration, who's an American and who is not an American, who can cross our borders seeking asylum and who cannot, is fueled by fear. Fear of those who are different, fear of those we don't know yet, fear of those we don't understand. And there are those in our society who preys upon that fear, cultivates that fear. And it is fueled by scarcity, that we have to take care of ourselves first and foremost, our family, our tribe, our nation. Thanksgiving and the scarcity mindset are the antithesis of one another. They don't mix, they don't meld. So how do we move beyond fear? How do we move beyond taking care of ourselves first and foremost? How do we move beyond a hoarding mentality? The antidote is found in what is called the gospel of abundance. There's a story in the Gospels where Jesus feeds the 5,000. It's after a long day and the people are far away from any town, and Jesus is tired, and his disciples go to the crowd and begin to disperse them and send them back to the villages where they can get food. The disciples are fueled by the economy of scarcity. They know that there are 5,000 people, and there's only a dozen or so disciples in Jesus, and they only have a little bit of bread and a little bit of dried fish, and they can't possibly feed 5,000 people. There's only so much to go around, they tell Jesus. And so the disciples begin to disperse the people. But Jesus says, have the people stay, and break them into communities of 50 and 100. And when the 5,000 had broken into these companies of 50 and 100, Jesus took what little food the disciples had, the bread and the dried fish, and he blessed it. He lifted it up to God, and he asked a prayer blessing upon the fish and the bread, and he laid it out before the crowd of 5,000. And essentially what he was saying is, everything I have is yours. Now, looking at this through the lens of scarcity, the disciples must have thought that Jesus was crazy. The crowd must have thought that Jesus was out of his mind. It's not how we operate today. But something happened. When I was a boy, I thought the miracle was that Jesus had a magic wand and said abracadabra, and the bread and the fish multiplied by the thousands, so everyone had enough. But I don't think that's what happened. Years ago, I heard a Quaker theologian named Parker Palmer offer this interpretation of that story. He said the real miracle of the feeding of the 5,000 was when Jesus broke the people into companies of 50 and 100, so that they had to look in each other's eyes. They had to see the parent who was struggling with her or his small children. They had to look at the elderly man or the elderly woman who was exhausted from the day's hike. They had to look at one another. They couldn't look away. They couldn't judge the other as different. They began to look at one another as fellow travelers, fellow human beings. And Parker Palmer, the theologian, says what happened next is extraordinary. The people saw how Jesus took from his seeming scarcity, his few loaves of bread and his few dried fish, and said, "Everything I have is yours." Parker Palmer thinks what happened that day was that people were moved by the abundant spirit of Jesus. They were moved by his generosity. They were moved by his selflessness, his fearlessness. And they began to share what little food they had with one another. And Parker Palmer suggests that people didn't walk out from the cities far away without anything. Some people had some dried dates or figs in their pockets. Others had pieces of bread or pieces of dried meat and extra water. And they looked around and they laid all their food before one another. And those who had little still had enough, and those who brought a lot with them because they were overly prepared or they had so much wealth, they too, as they shared with one another in commonality at a common table, had enough. This, says Parker Palmer, was the miracle that Jesus brought about that day in the feeding of the 5,000. That, he says, is the gospel of abundance. Or as the Italians say, abbondanza. Abbondanza. Abundance. There's enough for everybody. When I was a boy, I would go to my buddy Rob's house. And Rob was from a good-sized Italian family. And when we would go to Rob's house after school, it seemed that his mom always had enough food. There was always, as she said, abbondanza. There was always some pasta fazool, some beans and noodles to share with us after a day of school. Or if I went in the evening and stopped by, there was always extra food for me. That is abundance. That is generosity. We live in a society that is often focused on the word me. Me and mine. We encourage in our culture, particularly in the United States, an individualistic culture. The political philosophy of being a libertarian is about taking care of me and mine, first and foremost. And that libertarian mindset has found its way into our wider political discourse and in this election. It's about me and mine. It's not about them. The disciples looked at the crowd of 5,000 and they said, "Jesus, we need to send them away. There's only so much to go around." But Jesus knew that the way of God isn't about me and mine. It's about us together, us as a community, us as the kingdom of God, us as Imago Dei, each one of us created in the image of God. And when we believe that to be true, whatever your faith tradition may or may not be, when we believe that we are each created in the image of God, Imago Dei, it means we each have inherent worth and inherent value. And that we have an opportunity, a responsibility, the privilege of sharing what we have with one another. This is heretical to the economy of scarcity, which governs much of our world and governs our nation's politics all too often. And if we're honest, governs our heart as well. But the miracle happened that day, on that dusty plain, far from any town, when 5,000 people were fed. Fed first and foremost by the selfless, seemingly reckless, loving witness of Jesus, who shared what little he had for the well-being of others. And the story ends by saying that there were baskets of bread and fish left over. Abundanza. Imagine what happens when you and I live our life with a spirit of abundance, knowing that we're part of a community, a wide, expansive community that has our back, and we have their back. And look what happens when we believe that that great mystery we call God, Spirit, is with us, and sometimes even carrying us. When we believe that we have one another and that we have a God who loves us and is with us, we can let go of fear. We can abandon the economy of scarcity, and we can embrace abundanza, and we can receive all of that great food, all of those great blessings, and we can share that food, those blessings, with others. Jesus also said, perfect love casts out fear. That perfect love it's called agape, which is a Greek word in the New Testament. It's a selfless love. It's a giving away love. Imagine what happens when you and I are guided by such a love. Thank you for listening to this episode of God in the Wild. Please share this episode with friends and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. You can follow God in the Wild on Facebook and Instagram at God in the Wild Pod. You can subscribe online and leave us a rating and review. This podcast is a production of the First Baptist Church of Beverly, Massachusetts. In the spirit of John Muir, go out into the wild and find and feed your soul. I'm Kent Harrop. Thanks for listening.